And now your mission, there are two caveats to what I'm about to say. Your mission is to listen and then give me a hard time during questions. But if you decide that you've finished your mission before I finish mine, then please snore quietly or gently leave and let the rest of us proceed. And then second is to manage your expectations. Whenever I do a lecture from in the military environment or the civilian environment, I always use this quote from H.G. Wells, which I love. And H.G. Wells is reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. So that's me. I'm not going to be talking from an intellectual point of view. I'm hopefully going to be talking from a very practical point of view. But I should add that H.G. Wells is reputed to have met Stalin once and left thinking Stalin was a nice bloke. So maybe I don't have to worry too much. So a little bit of my background and the journey that I was on as I joined the military. I joined as an army cadet, first of all, in 1964. My father retired to Somerset, and I should have said earlier on that I've got my big brother sitting in the front here, who's going to give me a hard time if this doesn't go well, so please be kind to me. My dad retired, or our dad retired to Somerset in the early 1960s, 61, 62, and I joined as an army cadet in 1964, barely 20 years after D-Day. And looking around the room, most of you remember those days, a very different military, much, much bigger, of course. And we wore uniform, so we hitchhiked around the country, and people would pick us up, and bus drivers wouldn't charge us, and cinemas wouldn't charge us to go in, and so on and so forth. It's really all I wanted to do. I was not academic, as H.G. Wells would agree with, but I was certainly not academic at school, so all I ever wanted to be was in the military. And I went to sign up in Bristol as a soldier to join the Somerset Cornwall Light Infantry, and there a captain, a guy called King, convinced me to try to go for a commission in the army. I went to an army college in 1967 to study A-levels, which I passed 3 at the lowest possible grade. I honestly don't think I would get in the army today in terms of the academic qualifications that are necessary. But I did 2 years there, and then 2 years at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and I was commissioned in 1971. And like everybody else in those days, of course, Northern Ireland was running hot, and so I spent time in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. In my case, I was what's called an ammunition technical officer, so I used to do bomb disposal work in Northern Ireland, dealing with the terrorist devices that the Catholics and indeed the Protestants were throwing around at the time. I then did 4 tours in Germany during the Cold War years. Remember in those days the Soviet Union on the other side of the inner German border? If you remember that, there was West Germany and East Germany. And of course, this, what's going on at the moment with Russia and Ukraine rather brings back some of the memories of those years. But we had a very big army commitment in Germany, 1st British Corps, with a strong Royal Air Force contingent as well. And actually, as late as 1990, the Cold War came to an end, if you remember, in 1989. As late as 1990, NATO had over 23,000 main battle tanks deployed in Germany and nearly 5,000 combat aircraft ready to fight, engage with the Warsaw Pact, who were estimated to have about 51,000 main battle tanks and about 6,000 combat aircraft, who we believe, genuinely believe, particularly in the 1980s, could have come across the inner German border at very short notice. So it was a serious business. We look back on it now. Thankfully, of course, we didn't have to fight. But nonetheless, at the time, it was pretty serious business. And I did 4 tours there, and 3 of them was a captain, and then a company commander, and then a commanding officer of a particular battalion based in Germany. I then served in Cyprus in the 1980s with the United Nations, 7 years after the Turkish invasion. And it was there in Cyprus on Easter Sunday, 1981, actually a visit to Jerusalem that my wife and I went on, my 30th birthday, visited Jerusalem, went to the Garden Tomb. I don't know whether anybody's heard of the Garden Tomb, and as a result of that became a Christian in 1981. I was a young captain at the time. The 1990s were a decade dominated by the Balkans. You remember the Balkans Wars, the ethnic cleansing that went on in the early 1990s. And I did 3 tours in the Balkans, initially with the implementation force that went into Bosnia, and then the sustainment force, and then the Kosovo operation called KFOR, and I commanded a brigade at that point, and got heavily involved in the massive refugee crisis that was going on in Kosovo at the time, and maybe touch on that a little bit later. And then in the 21st century, as we turn through to the 2000s, of course September the 11th happened, and then the Iraq campaign, and then Afghanistan. And I should have said earlier on, back in 1991, I was part of 1st Armoured Division in the First Gulf War, when we kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and then decided, in my opinion rightly, not to go on to Baghdad, not to go on to Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein at that point. But one of my maxims in life, one of the sort of mantras, is that all choices carry consequences, and that decision certainly carried big consequences in terms of Iraq. And there's no doubt at all in my mind that probably a couple of 100,000 people died in Iraq as a result of that continuing regime under Saddam Hussein in those years. And I left the army in 2007, and looking back, it was fantastic. I was very lucky. I loved, and it sounds a bit pathetic really, but I loved every day of my military service. I served alongside a mix of international military, media, diplomats, civil servants, a whole mass of non-governmental aid organisations, UN agencies like UNHCR and others, and then increasingly over the last decade or so, many private sector players, particularly in the logistics world, contractors on operations, engineering, and so forth in those sorts of areas. And over those years, I saw the reality behind the headlines. And that reality was the gangsters, the protection rackets, places like Northern Ireland, the greed, the desire for power, and experienced at first hand the religious, ethnic, and cultural bigotry that divides our world, and the brutality that flows from it, dealing in Sunni, Shia, Protestant, Catholic, Turks in the north of Cyprus, Greeks in the south, and so on and so forth. And I can assure you that such bigotry is not one-sided. There are very rarely goodies or baddies in this business. And from it all emerged a couple of issues which might help set the context for my thoughts on being a Christian soldier. And first of all, it's important to say that there are no easy answers here. I'm telling you my story. I hope it's some interest and will help you understand why I made the decisions I did. But there will be people who see different aspects of this story and see that differently, and that's perfectly fine and understandable. Nigel Bigger, some of you may have heard of, is a professor of moral and pastoral theology at Oxford, and I work with Nigel in various guises. He wrote a book called In Defence of War. And he says in that book, no human action or enterprise is pure or unblemished. Whilst this does not mean that no human action can ever be right, it does mean that no war between human beings will ever be just in a pure sense. We need to acknowledge that war will always be waged by one set of sinners against another, that it always causes terrible evils, and it always drags us into places which we would not want to go to, or indeed expect to go to, often when the war starts. But does that mean that war and the actions within it can never be justified? That's one of the questions that Nigel poses in his book, and in a way, is what we're about this evening. And second, and following on from this, when you see the terrible effects of terrorism and war, including, as I have, watched the mass graves being dug up in places like Iraq and the Balkans, words like sin and evil don't just remain interesting theological issues. They illuminate the stark reality of a broken and brutal world. And as a human being, never mind as a Christian, it inevitably left me, for one, questioning how exactly should we deal with that sin and that evil? Deal with people prepared to use any means to achieve their ends. Suicide bombers, ethnic massacres, indiscriminate terrorism, and the bloody combat that flows from all of that. How do we establish justice and deliver moral, ethical, and legal accountability in such a brutal world? And all of that lies within a paradox. What is it that the principal role of the British military, The reason it exists is to deliver what we call in our doctrine, the army doctrine, fighting power. That's why we exist, to deliver fighting power onto a battlefield, not to be nice. There are no prizes for coming second on a battlefield. The test is war and battle. The result is triumph or defeat. And the end result is that while some, like the British government, for example, would argue that the military can be a force for good, events in the real world have a habit of interfering, and there is rarely any certainty on how things will turn out, as Putin and Russia are finding out at the moment in Ukraine. A Canadian parachute battalion had to be disbanded in disgrace when its soldiers lost self-control in Somalia in 1993. And on that same operation, that same deployment, you may remember, a unit of US Army Rangers were overwhelmed and butchered, soldiers' bodies dragged through the streets in front of all of those watching on CNN. In Rwanda, in 1994, a small UN force led by a Canadian general, Dallaire, who I've met, and is an extraordinary guy, those forces had to stand by and watch as 800,000 people were massacred, not using modern weapons, but by machete and other means. And the Dutch troops in Srebrenica in 1995 had rules of engagement that didn't, in theory anyway, allow them to respond to Serb ethnic cleansing. Many, of course, opposed operations in Iraq in 2003. But in Syria, tens of thousands of people died as the world watched, apparently powerless to do anything about it. And in that context, maybe the answer is, it's all too difficult. Let's just stay out of it. In such a complex world of chaos and uncertainty, can there ever be such a thing as a just war? And should Christians be involved? Or should we simply stay out of it all, leaving it up to others to resolve the mess, and then joining in the chorus of criticism from the touchline when it all goes wrong? Remembering that I was a 30-year-old captain in 1981 when I became a Christian, my first decision had to be, can I stay or should I leave? And that sort of took a certain amount of time, as you can imagine, in conversation with good friends, Christian friends and others, studying the scriptures, praying, and trying to decide what the right action was. Now, leaving aside the fact that Jesus, of course, used force to clear the temple of the money changers, and he gives the Pharisees and the teachers of the law a pretty hard time in the Gospels, and he declares in Luke chapter 12 that he didn't come on the earth to bring peace but division, there are various passages that I just want to look at, which in the New Testament that refer to the military in particular. In chapter 3 of Luke's Gospel, you remember the story of various people going to John the Baptist when he was baptizing people at the River Jordan. And one of those groups of people were some young soldiers. And they, like others, said to John the Baptist, "What must we do to be saved?" And I always think John the Baptist gave a rather unfortunate answer. He said, "Be content with your pay." And what he was saying to them basically was, don't abuse your power. He didn't say, leave the military, which in Roman days, of course, would have been pretty difficult, but nonetheless, he could have said that. But what he said was, don't abuse your power. Don't force people to do things. Don't extort money from people, and so on and so forth. The Message translation says, no shakedowns, no blackmail, be content with your rations. In Matthew chapter 8, you probably remember the story that Jesus meets a centurion who asks for his help. His servant is paralyzed and in terrible suffering. And Jesus says to the man, "I will come to your home and I will heal your servant." And the centurion says, no, we don't need to go anywhere. I'm a soldier. I tell people what to do. I say, come here, and they come. I say to people, go there, and they go. He said to Jesus, all you need to do is give the word of command, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus, we're told, is astonished at what he hears. And he says to those following him that he hasn't found anyone in Israel with such great faith. And he then proclaims that many outsiders will take their place at what he calls the feast in the kingdom of heaven. And the centurion's servant, of course, is healed. In Mark chapter 16, we read of a centurion at the crucifixion who declares that Jesus was surely the Son of God. And the whole of Acts chapter 10 is taken up with the story of Peter baptizing a centurion called Cornelius, who was a member of the Italian regiment, together with his family. We haven't got time to go through the whole story, but in simple terms, Peter goes to this family and baptizes them. Probably the first non-Jewish Gentile family baptized into the Christian faith. So there was something fundamentally flawed with being a soldier, as he was, then why would the good Lord have taken Peter and used him to baptize that family in that way? And later in Acts, Paul talks of a centurion from the imperial regiment showing him kindness on the journey by sea to Rome, and then sparing his life after they were shipwrecked. And Paul in his letters, if you read the letters, particularly the letter to Timothy, which you might not be surprised is one of my favourites, or a couple of my favourites, he uses a lot of soldierly language. So the bottom line is that nowhere are soldiers condemned for being soldiers, or told that they must leave the military. Indeed, the opposite seems to be the case. Now, many Christians, particularly Christian pacifists, would argue that we shouldn't rely on those sorts of examples. Our only example must be Jesus, who, so the argument goes, is a pacifist. And more importantly, he destroys the idea of a just war in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, that's a perfectly understandable and valid opinion to hold, but I have to tell you I'm not quite so sure that it's correct. In chapter 10 of Luke's Gospel, Jesus does famously tell his disciples that they should go out as lambs amongst wolves, without a purse or bag or sandals, as workers in the harvest field. And throughout the Gospels, Jesus himself heads purposefully for the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing full well what is going to happen to him, and knowing that he must refuse to allow his disciples to use force to stop him being crucified or to protect him. But less often quoted, later on in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, Jesus actually reverses those earlier instructions. In chapter 22, verse 36, at the Last Supper, in the upper room, the night before the crucifixion and his arrest, he says, "But now, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." And one of the disciples says, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords." To which Jesus replies, "That's enough." Now, some say that Jesus' call to find a sword was somehow heavily ironic, or that he spoke in frustration or figuratively. But I have to be honest, I'm a pretty simple soul, and I happen to believe that what Jesus says is what he means, and he means what he says. And some time ago, I exchanged emails with Nigel Bigger, the chap I referred to earlier, about this verse. And he replied, "I confess I've never thought about this before. The meaning may seem obscure, but any scepticism about just war's significance only works if Jesus was speaking figuratively. That is, that he didn't really mean them to take the 2 swords. If he meant what he said, then that is one reason not to accept that Jesus was a pacifist." So if Jesus was leading a movement where non-violence was a critical article of faith, it seems to be inconceivable that his followers would be carrying swords into the upper room for the Last Supper the night before the crucifixion, and then carrying them with them into the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of his arrest. But it's also clear, as I alluded to earlier, that the garden was not the place to use swords. Jesus would not be diverted from being taken to the cross, which is why he commands Peter to put up his sword in John's Gospel, adding, "Shall I not drink the cup that my Father has given me?" Now, I do appreciate that others will have a different perspective, and maybe that will come out during the questions, indeed a different calling. But for me, it is too easy to argue that an unjust peace is better than a just war. I've had this conversation with a professor on a radio programme. He was sitting in a study in Oxford and said, "Better an unjust peace than a just war." And I said, "Professor, that's easy for you to say, sitting in your panelled study in Oxford University. You're not the one that the bombs are being dropped on in Aleppo, or blown up on the streets of Northern Ireland, or etc., etc." Peace sometimes permits terrible evils to reign. And as I said earlier, all choices carry consequences. And choosing not to go to war has serious consequences that need justifying too. Jesus told Peter to put away his sword in John's Gospel, and added in Matthew, of course, that all who draw the sword or live by the sword shall die by the sword. And throughout history, there have been numerous organisations that have drawn and lived by the sword. The Nazis, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Milosevic, Saddam, ISIS, the list rolls on. But it seems to me that we can all too easily fall into the trap of wishful thinking. Allowing such evil to reign is not simply an easy thing to do, it's not sweet innocence, if you like. Whilst we live in freedom and democracy, the harsh reality is that large numbers of people exist under the thrall of non-democratic regimes and dictatorships. And their leaders of those countries do not hesitate to use force as and when they feel the need. Choosing when and where to use the sword against these regimes clearly isn't easy. And politicians have to make tough choices, knowing that they're going to get a lot of criticism, whatever choice they make. But the problem with a pacifist position is it does require the rest of the world essentially to leave them alone. A perennial weakness because sadly the world doesn't tend to leave us, or more importantly, others, alone. Even the Mennonites abandoned their pacifist principles in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, fighting back in the end against the brutality that was being levelled against them, still controversial even today. And the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr warned in the 1930s, pacifism either tempts us to make no judgments at all, or to give an undue preference to tyranny. Pretty powerful statement, but I have to say I've seen that reflected over the years that I've served. But the bottom line is that process that I've talked through, which I worked my way through in 1981-82, led me to the view that pacifism wasn't for me. I came to the conclusion that in the same way that we need a police force in this country to capture the burglars and deal with murders, like this young 7-year-old girl who was killed in Liverpool recently, and sometimes those policemen need to enforce the law, if necessary using force. So there are times when the international community needs to use force as well, needs to enforce the law, the international law. So I decided to stay. The next question was, okay, if you're staying, how then do you live out your Christian faith in the military? What does that look like? And there were two particular passages that I found helpful as I tried to work my way through this. First one is Joshua, and we were chatting, David and I were chatting earlier on. I mean, the book of Joshua is a pretty violent book, as we all know, as he takes the promised land. But there's a lovely story at the beginning of Joshua, the book of Joshua, and I think it's about chapter 5, chapter 6, where before the battle of Jericho, Joshua is on his own, preparing for the battle, preparing to fight the next day, and we're told that he meets a man dressed in armour. And I have to say, I have every understanding of what Joshua was doing here. I mean, I've been there myself prior to places like Iraq and Northern Ireland times and so forth. As a leader, as a commander, you just take yourself away and you ask yourself some pretty serious questions. Are we doing the right thing here? Am I going to survive? Will I live? Will we win? How are we going to engage with all of this? So Joshua's standing there, meets this man dressed in armour, and he asks the man a very sensible question. He says to him, are you on our side or are you on their side? And if you remember the story, some of you may remember the story, the man replies, no, or in some translations, neither. Not very helpful answer, really. But at that point, Joshua, we're told, falls down, takes off his sandals, and then says, because the man dressed in armour says, but as the commander of the Lord's army, I have now come. Joshua bows down, takes off his sandals, and says, what are my Lord's commands? Now, in human terms, having been there myself, if I'd found something like this, my natural reaction would have been to call the sergeant major, arrest the bloke, and put him in prison, probably. But Joshua asks this man what the Lord's commands are. And he gets, if you remember the story, he gets the most ridiculous battle plan. The guy says, right, what I want you to do is march around Jericho 7 times over 7 days, blow some trumpets, the walls will fall down, it'll be fine. And Joshua must have thought, this is crazy. This isn't going to happen. But he does what he is told by this guy, who he believes, and we read, is a commander of the Lord's army. He has been sent by the good Lord to give Joshua these instructions. And the result is, as we all learnt at Sunday school, or many of us would have learnt at Sunday school, that the walls come tumbling down. And for me, there's lots of issues in the story, but for me, the key issue is God is not a mercenary to fight on my behalf. He's not an Englishman, or an American, or anybody else. The question is not, is God on my side as I go into battle, but am I on God's side? Am I trying to bring justice and righteousness to this situation? Are we aiming to use force in that way, or are we simply trying to apply brutal force in some sort of conquest? Which, of course, in some respects, is why the wider story of Joshua is so interesting. The second story is in the book of Judges. It happened about 3,000 years ago. You may remember the story again. The Hebrew nation is being attacked by a very aggressive nation, the Midianites, and to defend themselves, they assemble an army, 32,000 strong, under Gideon's leadership. And as he prepares to go into battle against the Midianites, Gideon asks another very sensible question. He bends down and prays and says, Lord, are we going to win this battle? And God says to Gideon, yes, you're going to win the battle, Gideon, but there's a problem. And Gideon says, what's that? And God says, your arm is too big. Oh, says Gideon. God says, I want you to assemble the army and tell them that if they don't fancy the fight, they can go home. So Gideon assembles 32,000 people, tells them they're going to have a fight, but if they don't fancy the fight, they're allowed to go home. 22,000 of them look at their watches and decide it's time for tea. And they leave 10,000 behind. Still too big, says God. Take them down to the lake and get them to drink. And those who bend down and lap the water like a dog, send them home. And those who reach down and lift the water in their hand and bring the water to their mouth, you can keep them. Actually, a pretty good military principle. Because if your head is down looking in the water, you're not looking around you, trying to see where the enemy is. Whereas if you're standing up and bringing the water to your mouth, you can look around and see what's going on. 9,700 of them kneel down and lap the water like a dog. Gideon is left with 300 people. He then goes on to fight what we would today call a brilliant maneuver warfare battle. The Midianites basically destroy themselves. Gideon puts people on the high ground, he breaks some lamps, breaks some jugs, makes lots of noise. The Midianites think they're being attacked, or they are being attacked, and they, as I say, basically destroy themselves. So what's going on here? Reduction from 32,000 to 300. I use this example quite a lot, and normally somebody at the back of the room shouts out defence cuts. But that's not what it's about, I don't think. It's something in the scriptures, like a sort of golden thread that runs through the scriptures. It's in Zechariah. In fact, it's written on that banner as you come through the door on the right-hand side. Not by might, nor by strength, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. This is not about numbers. It's not about power in an earthly sense. It's about justice and righteousness, and by God's Spirit. So the clear message for me was that I was to do my best to serve under the direction of the Spirit of God, using my gifts, my talents, to bring about justice and righteousness into a broken, sinful, and fallen world. And in doing so, remember, it's not about numbers, but it's about God's Spirit. Which brings me to my final point. If we ask the question, can a Christian serve in the military? I think we must also ask the question, would the military better, particularly the British military, be better if there were no Christians in it? Do we think that the British Army would be a better place if there were no Christians serving in it? As I mentioned earlier, the purpose and measure of the military is to deliver fighting power. And at the heart of fighting power is the will to win, the determination to succeed against all the odds. And actually we're seeing that will to win in spades in the Ukrainian military as against the Russian soldiers, who clearly don't have that strong will to win. And we put that comment under the umbrella of what we call the moral component of fighting power. How do we get people to fight and be prepared to die on the battlefield, if necessary? And fighting power is morally based because all contact and activity between people is always morally charged. Sometimes only slightly, but often substantially. It's very difficult to calculate. You can't count it like tanks and aeroplanes that I referred to in the Cold War years. It's different to that. It rests, I think, ultimately on character. The key differentiator between a good army and the brutal army. Take away character and you are left with pure militarism. Character provides the underpinning framework for justice and righteousness. They're determined to adhere to codes of behaviour, to follow the Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, and crucially to face up to the reality that we, the British Army, like any other organisation, is made up of flawed human beings who get it wrong. And when we do get it wrong, we need to acknowledge the reality of that. That's what separates out the good army from the brutal, between an army that uses the power to be a force for good and a destructive one that abuses that power. The problem is that our so-called civilization is covered with a thin varnish. Scratch it and underneath you find usually fear driving things. Democracies have to preserve the coat of varnish in a good state of repair because operating outside the law and the moral code, outside of an ethical framework, always scratches the varnish. So we in the military need to stand firm against scratching that varnish too deeply. Military is not driven by fear. But character can't be taught or legislated for or bought. At its heart, as Aristotle taught it, character is a habit, the daily choice of right instead of wrong. It's a moral quality. Grows to maturity in peace, and it's not suddenly developed at the outbreak of war. Our fate on the battlefield, or in the battlefield of the business in life, city and elsewhere, is worked out long before the crisis breaks out, long before the war begins. Character is the inner core that makes anyone or anything what it is, whether that's people or wine or a period in history. It's deeper and different from concepts like personality or image or reputation. It's the core reality in which our thoughts and words, decisions and behaviours are rooted. It defines who we are and it determines our behaviour. It's who we are and what we get up to in the dark when we don't think anybody's watching. It's a great definition. Character is who we are and what we get up to in the dark when we don't think anybody's watching. And if the British military is going to maintain a strong moral component, then I, for one, would argue it desperately needs Christians throughout the military, in all its ranks, but particularly in its senior ranks, to give a clear sense of personal identity, a strong sense of purpose and mission, all the things that help us through tough times. So can a Christian serve in the military? I think so. Indeed, I think and would argue that they must. We need Christians everywhere. In politics, in business, education, the media, the police, the judiciary. As David and I were saying earlier on this evening, even in banking. And especially in the military. And I would add that we could probably do with a few more in the non-military organisations that deal with issues like the beginning and end of life, and many others like them. We need men, Christian men and women, to influence our decision makers, to stand up and be counted in every aspect of life, and to stand firm when the situation gets tough. 22, that's me.
Well done.